Hey everyone, in today's episode I want to go over the exact schedule that I used to pass step 1 in 4 weeks of dedicated studying. And so I'm going to go through 2 different schedules. I'm going to go through my first 4-week pre-dedicated schedule, and then I'm going to go through my 4-week dedicated period schedule. And so I did a 4-week pre-dedicated schedule because I was still taking classes during that time, and so I was studying basically 2 to 3 hours per day for a month before my actual 4-week dedicated period where I did nothing but study for step 1 all day pretty much. And so we'll get right into it, but first, if you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, make sure you watch the YouTube video because then you can kind of follow along and you'll get more out of this episode. All right, we'll get right into it. So this is my schedule, and I'm going to go through the very basics first, and I'm going to highlight certain things, and then I'm going to talk about the details. And so this is my 4-week pre-dedicated schedule, so let me just write that in. And so what you see here on the top, Pathoma, Sketchy Micro, and Sketchy Farm, these are essentially the resources that I used to study all of the content before I actually took step 1. And so I took step 1 at the end of my clinical year because that's how our curriculum was set up. So I was a little bit lacking on the basic science resources and the basic science content. And so I studied Pathoma, I studied Sketchy Micro, and I also studied some Sketchy Farm, which you can see here. And so what I did was I started off by studying a couple of hours each day. And the schedule that I had set was on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, I'm going to be doing Pathoma. And so 3, 6, 9. And so that's 9 hours of studying Pathoma per week. And of course, I went on vacation for a little bit because my class was actually only 3 days a week. Because I was taking an elective. And so I had more time to relax and just go on vacation while I was studying for step 1, which goes to show that it doesn't have to be extremely stressful. But this was my pre-dedicated period, just to make it clear. So I did Pathoma for about 9 hours per week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And then on Thursday and Friday, and as well as Saturday and Sunday during the second week, I did 4 hours of micro. And to be clear, this is watching 4 total hours of the content. Let's say there was 4 hours of content. I spent probably close to 2 to 3 hours because I would watch it anywhere between 1.5x to 2x speed. And so this 4 hours of micro content is actually probably equal to around 3 hours of actual studying, or this 3 hours of Pathoma, I was taking my time going slowly and taking notes, so this is actually around 3 hours. So that's what I did for the first 2 weeks. And then for the third week, I was switching between Pathoma and Sketchy Farm. And so I did 3 hours of Pathoma, 2 hours of Sketchy Farm when I was back home from class. So I did that for the next 2 weeks, and then went on another mini vacation. You gotta take the time when you have the time, of course. So I went on 2 little 4-day trips with my fiance during that time. But I was still able to keep up with my Anki, and I'll get into that a little bit later. And so at the end of my 4th pre-dedicated period, I started doing UWorld, and so I basically did around 80 to 120 questions during those times each day. And then I took my first UWorld full-length test, and so this is key. And so this first UWorld full-length test, you want to take at the end of your pre-dedicated period. And if you're not taking a 4-week pre-dedicated, this is just the end of your regular preclinical curriculum, then that's fine. You can just take it right before you start your dedicated period. And I took this, and then I went to New York just to see my family and travel a little bit. Make sure you're doing a full-length exam just to set a baseline of where you are and what your score is, and to see how you can improve from there on forward. And so just to explain what I have written up here, this is how many total hours there are of each of this content. And so there's 35 total hours of Pathoma, and I'll go through the details very soon. There's 14 total hours of Sketchy Micro to watch, and there's 27 total hours of Sketchy Farm that you can watch, and this is at 1x speed. And so if there's 14 hours of Sketchy Micro, and you watch the whole thing at 2x speed rather, then you'll finish everything in 7 hours, which I don't recommend watching the whole thing in 2x speed because you won't remember a lot of it, but watching it at 1.5x speed and then doing the Anki cards for it on the Anking deck, that's Anking deck, that's correlated with these Sketchy Micro cards, that will take you about maybe 10 hours if you watch it at 1.5x speed, plus another however many hours the Anki cards will take. And so that's Pathoma, 35 hours. Honestly, Pathoma took the longest time, and what everyone says is that going through chapters 1 through 4 is the highest yield. So if you don't have time to watch the entire 35 hours of Pathoma, which I do recommend, it actually was pretty great to get a foundation. If you don't have that time, then just chapters 1 through 4 and maybe even chapters 1 through 8 are probably your highest yield chapters. So now let's go into the details. And so now we're getting to the part where I kind of timed out exactly how many hours I'm going to do on each day. So let's start over here. So all of this right here is where we're going to start. This is Pathoma. So on the left, I have my weeks 1 through 4. I'm still in the pre-dedicated period that I'm talking about right now. We're in weeks 1 through 4. On week 1, I calculated how many minutes each of these sections are going to take and how many hours they're going to take. And so in week 1, this was my goal. I wanted to make sure that I had enough time after class to do this realistically. And I think just a general principle to take away from this is make sure that you're planning this ahead of time, especially if you're planning to do some vacations in between with this free time, or you have class or you have clinic or other obligations. You want to make sure that you plan ahead of time and look at exactly how many hours you'll need to spend per day on this. So going back to the content, we have essentially close to 8 to 10 hours per couple of sections per week. And so the goal was 8 to 10 hours per week. And so this was the first 2 weeks. Chapters 1 through 8 are the highest yield. So this is what you'll really need to know to get, I would say, maybe 50 to 60% of the content through that will actually show up on the exam. Everything else is important, but I feel like these first couple chapters are extremely important. And so this is what I did. And so this was week 2 for me. And these chapters are a little bit shorter, as you can see here and here. They are shorter, but you can do more of them. So this is what I did for week 2. Now week 3, I did chapters 9 through 13. And again, some of these chapters are quite short. And then week 4, I did the remaining. And these chapters are, again, quite short. So this is very doable if you take a step back and make sure that you're taking the time to carefully go through these videos, watch them at maybe 1.5 to 2x speed at most, and taking notes while you're doing it. And make sure that you have the time blocked off in your calendar before you put other things in your calendar. Like before you put time to hang out with your friends, make sure that you have at least 2 to 3 hours per day during your pre-dedicated period blocked off. So now let's talk about sketchy. And so this side over here is the sketchy side. And so this is what I was watching. And as I mentioned before, we're starting on week 2 because here I actually was on vacation and I didn't start watching Sketchy Micro or Sketchy Farm until I actually came back from vacation. And so week 2, this is how many hours it would take. And if you actually take a look here, this actually isn't that many hours. Sketchy Farm is the one that takes a lot more time, but Sketchy Micro, there isn't so much of it, so I would say watch all of it. Even the low yield things like protozoans, some of them might show up on your exam, and they for sure showed up on mine. So make sure you watch all of those and you understand everything in the Sketchy Farm and Sketchy Micro videos. And so if I go scroll back up here to Sketchy Micro, you'll see that I did about 3 to 4 hours here, 4 hours here, and then on the weekend I wanted to do some other things, so I only spent about 2 hours on those weekends. In terms of the highest yield things to see on Sketchy, I would say for sure the bacteria and for sure the fungi. The viruses are actually not that high yield from my experience. I don't think I saw too many virus questions on the test. In general, like through UWorld, I didn't see that many virus questions, so I wouldn't recommend going super in depth into those, but for sure the bacteria and fungi are extremely important. Next was Sketchy Farm. And this is Farm, and this in week 2 is Micro. And I want to highlight a few things here. So if you already did all of your preclinical pharmacology exams, then a lot of the Sketchy Farm might be redundant, but I'll highlight the ones that I did that I found was super helpful. First were the autonomic drugs, extremely important. The pressors, the alphas, the betas, you want to know all the different receptors. This is extremely high yield for the exam. Next was the smooth muscles. I didn't really know any of these drugs, or I knew about them, but I didn't know the specifics like endothelin receptors and all of those things, so highly recommend that. And for sure, this is where you're gonna get a huge bang for your buck, is watching the antibiotic and anti-metabolite Sketchy Farm videos. These are extremely high yield, and I highly recommend that if you had to prioritize any of these, I would recommend prioritizing autonomic, smooth muscle, antibiotics, and anti-metabolites. Total, you'll see these two take about 7 hours, and honestly, this and this doesn't take that many extra hours. So I didn't spend too many hours on Farm. I did maybe 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 total hours of sketchy farm, and that comprised these sections, so autonomic, smooth muscle, antibiotics, and antimetabolites. And I honestly, for cardiorenal, blood, GI endo, and neuropsych, I actually did these while I was on my clerkships, and so if you haven't gone through these, I do recommend going through them, but if you already went through them while you were studying for your courses or on your clerkships, then obviously you don't need to go through them again because you probably know these pretty well by now. So now let's move on to the last section, which is my actual dedicated study period. So this is step 1, dedicated. Great. And so now let's talk about this. So I had 4 weeks of step 1 studying, and then I had step 1 at the end. And so these are the 4 weeks. And so I didn't really do much because this was right before Thanksgiving. And yes, I took my step 1 on Christmas Eve. Don't recommend it. So this is when I took my first UWorld self-examination, number 1. And so this was my kind of baseline practice test. And what I did was I got a 232 on that, but I saw that a lot of times it overestimates your score, so I didn't take that too much into account. Then I essentially took a break for a full week because I was traveling, I was going to New York, seeing family, it was vacation time. Then what I did was I took the NBME practice exams all on Sundays, and that is because I had step 1 on Sunday, so I wanted to emulate how the exam would feel every single Sunday. And I wrote my scores down on the right here. And as you can see, if you're studying well and you're making sure you're keeping up with your Anki cards and your reviews, that your score should be going up. Maybe it won't completely go up every single test. It might drop here and there because some tests are actually harder than others. But in general, you should see an upward trend. And basically, this was my schedule. On Sundays, I would take practice tests, and on Mondays, I would do targeted sections based off of my weaknesses on those practice tests. So let's say I got a lot of the farm questions wrong, I would do more of those on Monday. And then what I would do is just UWorld basically every other day. And so I did 3 sections of 40 UWorld questions per day. I did them untutored, and I also did them untimed because I really wasn't tight on time, so that wasn't one of my concerns. But if you are finding it difficult to stay on time, then I would recommend practicing on the timed mode. But essentially, that was the first 3 weeks. Weeks 1, weeks 2, weeks 3, just a ton of UWorld, and then doing an NBME practice exam at the end of the week on Sunday. So at the beginning of week 4, I reviewed all of my NBMEs on Monday from 28, 29, 30, and 31. And then I did the free 120 questions. That was the 2021 version. So that was the old version, which you can find online for free. Then I reviewed not only this on the following day on Wednesday, but I also reviewed the previous NBMEs again. And this is just so I made sure that I understood all of the content and that I wasn't missing anything from any of the NBMEs that I took. Then finally, I did the new version of the free 120 questions. And from what I've heard, this is actually the most representative of your real score. And of course, this is pass-fail. Step 1, you're not going to get a score, but it's actually very important for you to understand what your score is there in order to gauge whether or not you're in the passing range. And then I actually took my test in New York City, so I drove back down the next day, and then honestly, the Saturday before was like light review. I kept up with my Anki cards. Maybe I read through some of my notes, but that was it. Relax the day before, make sure you sleep well, make sure you eat well, you hydrate, and you should be ready for the exam. So that's it. That's my 4-week dedicated period schedule, as well as my 4-week pre-dedicated period schedule. I hope going through the exact day-by-day breakdown of what I studied, when I studied, how many hours I studied, and on which days was helpful for you and for anyone that's looking to do this test in about 4 weeks and hopefully pass it at the end. I know that it's a really challenging time and there's a lot to learn and a lot to study all at once, but anyone can do it for just 4 weeks. I hope that this is helpful and shows you a more realistic schedule than something you might see on Reddit or on YouTube, and hopefully you'll pass step 1 with flying colors. See you next time.